esoteric bookshop in Torquay in the early 1970s. They sold posters of Salvador Dali's painting, which was swans reflecting elephants. There is a shop in Torquay in the early 1970s. They sold posters of Salvador Dali's painting, which was swans reflecting elephants. There is an example of a Dali over there, but I'm not focusing on Dali, I'm just mentioning my sort of intro to surrealism. With Devoe, because I write, it was through literature that I arrived at Paul Devoe's paintings, and it was through a writer called J.G. Ballard. And what both of these artists have in common, in reference to Ballard, is trauma. This particular painting was actually created in Brussels during the bombardment, during the Second World War. The Germans were actually attacking that area. So while he was in the studio, he would have been exposed to basically warfare. Now, Devoe was with the Surrealists, you've got two schools of thoughts with sort of, how can I put it, psychiatry, with two schools with like Nietzsche, whereas with Carrington, it is more interpretation of dreams, Freud. So I think that Devoe was sort of in his outlook towards humanity was more extreme, and certainly Ballard is very dystopian. And I'm going to use this quote because he puts it better than I possibly could. The psychology of that moment, relating to when the bombardment was taking place during the war, was very exceptional, full of drama and anguish. Devoe wanted to express this anguish in the picture, contrasting the calm of Venus, which he does, which is, for me, surrealism in some ways is one of the purest art forms there is, because it presents you with something you're familiar with, but in a way you haven't seen before, in a totally different context. It's like with everything within that picture, you can describe it to reasonable reference. You don't need to have a great knowledge of architecture to see the influence of Greek Roman architecture, the references to death with the skeleton, which interestingly relates both to Devoe and Carrington. They both say that things that happen in childhood stay with you throughout your life. And interestingly, Devoe's school, and it was the music room for some reason, had a skeleton in it. And this is a recurring motif in quite a few of his paintings, the skeleton. And also Devoe was influenced by De Silico. And De Silico, if I remember rightly, was of Greek ancestry. And a lot of his work, many of the artists within this room were influenced by De Silico. Magritte over there, obviously Carrington as well. I believe Picasso as well. I believe De Silico financially assisted Picasso at one point, but that's something else. So, coming back to J.G. Ballard, Ballard actually had two Devoe paintings commissioned. I don't know if you're familiar with the book Empire of the Sun and the film by Steven Spielberg. When Ballard made quite a lot of money through that film, he bought these two paintings, and they were created by an American artist. Now, I reference these two paintings because they were both destroyed in the Blitz, which again, we come back to trauma, the Second World War. So, the woman, an American artist who recreated these paintings, and here it is, I believe this one is called The Mirror, and that's a picture of Ballard at his desk. They would have been in black and white. So it's a really interesting sort of, it's an interesting thought that these were recreated, you know, in colours that possibly maybe they weren't this colour. And this is called The Violation. And the influence that these paintings had on Ballard, for me, I find it very interesting, because this is not like a screensaver on a Mac, something which is constantly changing. This is a fixed image, and he wrote many books sitting at this desk with that image by the desk. which I find is, in these times of fleeting attention spans and the like, I think that's a very valid sort of thought. And coming back to Ballard, coming back to this sort of, it's quite dystopian. It's his childhood. He grew up in Shanghai under the Japanese occupation in World War II. Ballard felt the works, meaning these ones by Defoe, evoke the environment of his boyhood, a bizarre external landscape propelled by large psychic forces. And again, the things that stay with you forever. Thinking of the abandoned casinos, the empty swimming pools, that sort of imagery with Ballard. But staying on the theme of trauma, we go over to Carrington. This particular painting is called Ilium, the title of the work, which is a Hebrew word for God or gods. Now, even though this isn't physically here, I'm not going to dwell on this painting too much because I want to take you to a painting that was originally there. I've got an image of it, which is of Carrington, which it reinforces sort of the theme of trauma more so. With this painting, with Carrington, again, there are reoccurring motifs. Now, Carrington was from a rich family that came from the north of England. They were nouveau rich. And her father had earned his money through textiles. It was something to do with rayon. I think it's a synthetic fabric. And it was a company called ICI, which I don't think exists anymore. The father didn't want her to be an artist. Interestingly, her mother gave her a book. Within it was images by Max Ernst. At this point, she was a young girl. I think she was 16. And the thing was that she was eventually to live with Max Ernst. It inspired her, this particular book, to go down to London to attend a Surrealist exhibition, and she became part of the Surrealist movement. And it's a bit, some of it, I don't agree with it, it's rather like the Beats. They were very sort of, it was like male-centric, and it was, which were the Surrealists to a degree, where the women were seen as muses, and clearly Carrington was much more than a muse, and she asserted herself. She was a very strong-willed woman, and she became a great artist within her own right. Within her own rights. It's quite a complicated story. With Carrington, she moved to Paris with Ernst, and they were part of the movement in Paris. Again, Silicon would have been involved in this movement. And they moved to the south of France. I believe Carrington's mother sort of dobbed in a few quid and helped her and Ernst buy a small cottage in the south of France, which Ernst decorated and this, that. Unfortunately, war broke out. Ernst was then interned by the French because he was German, and then when the Germans invaded, he was interned by the Germans because he was Jewish. At this point, Carrington lost contact with him. This is the theme of trauma, not just in the artwork, but certainly within her life. She lost contact with him, and she had a nervous breakdown. She ended up in an asylum, and she was treated with what would now be seen as ECG, against her own will. While she'd been in Paris, she'd made contact. She'd met a Mexican guy that was sort of involved with the arts, but was involved with the embassy, the Mexican embassy. To cut a long story short, she managed to get out of this institution. Her father wanted her out, but she managed to send her nanny over to collect her. However, she managed to escape from their clutches, and she met this Mexican by chance in a restaurant in Portugal. They agreed to an arranged marriage so that she could get out of the country. It's very Casablanca. It's interzone. It's sort of getting out of a neutral country to New York. Ernst, in the meantime, who was a bit of a poodle faker, he was a ladies' man. He'd gone off with Peggy Guggenheim, who was a very rich art collector at the Guggenheim Museum in Venice. And weirdly, as Guggenheim was flying with Ernst on a Panorama Clipper to New York, Carrington was on a boat with her new husband going towards New York as well. She went to New York, she eventually went to Mexico. She left this man and she married another man called Chiefy Weiss. And they didn't do anything, it was a case of getting on with it, pull your socks up, toughen up. And by the 1960s, she, I wouldn't say softened, but I think she realised that there were things that would have been better dealt with than left in the dark. And she met a doctor called Dr. Abraham Fortes. This is in Mexico. And he was sympathetic to the art community. He was known to a lot, he was a collector as well. And she attended many therapy sessions with him. And he was actually represented 3 times within this painting. And again, there are these recurring motifs. And a lot of them come from her nanny, who I mentioned earlier, was of Irish descent, and so was her mother. And there was a lot of belief in fairies and the supernatural. But it's the way it's represented in her paintings. It's not as like the Victorian painting of the superimposed fairies in the garden. They're very sort of like Mexico, of Egypt, like Egyptology. They're not the figment of an imagination that came from the north of England. I find that very interesting as well. But this is painted in 1963, it's called Transference. And she actually gave the painting to Dr. Abraham. So in a way it was like something, this issue was dealt with, it was represented physically in this painting, and then she handed it.